Hello and welcome to another SDAQ&A. My very special guest today is Gillian Ford. How are you, Gillian?
Very good, thank you.
It's good to have you back on the program. This is what we were originally calling 3 of 3, but we're going to probably have a few more
Yeah.
up our sleeve with this one. And we've been reading very interesting letters to Des and yourself, and replies as well, particularly around, I guess, that from 77 to about 1984, that era around Glacier View. And what I'm finding is that they're giving us a terrific behind the scenes look at what was going on there. So give us a little bit of a insight into what we're doing today. Part 3 of our series, Season 4, Episode 19. While I just quickly do something here that I need to do.
Okay, so the first episode we read some of Parmenter's letters to and fro death. The second one we were talking more about Dr. Hamill, and as a result of that, I have reformatted the missing article in his biography, which was about Glacier View. He didn't put it in that book, which was published, I think, about 1990, maybe a little bit later. So that's going in volume 3. And now we're looking at, well, the first letter is from Des to Russell Standish. That's 1976, but most of them are in the Glacier View realm.
I'm just opening up that file, and we will dive straight in.
So there's about 52 pages in this file, and I just picked out some of the documents. Now I'm working on volume 3. I have everything in it that's going in, but I have to retype quite a bit of it. There's another 80 or 90 pages of letters and some important ones. So I'm really glad now that I'm working on volume 3, and it's pretty much exactly the same size, 484 pages as the other two. Which
That's
really
exciting, because originally I was thinking you may not be releasing 3 for ages, but it sounds like it might be sooner than later, which I like.
Well, it's got to be proved. That may take months. It's a big proving job. And I cannot put pressure.
I was thinking you were talking about years. Well, let's get started. Hi, big welcome to everybody, by the way. I think Moto Sapien has joined us again. He says he's on time this time. That's great. Welcome. And just a quick...
And he's in Tahoe.
Tahoe, yep. And a quick reminder, everyone, if you're watching right now, just lean forward, click the like button on Facebook, on YouTube, click like and subscribe. It really, really helps. Very easy to do. Also, if you'd like to support what I'm doing, and I'm currently working on season 2, which is 86 interviews. The whole season was dedicated to the retrospective, excuse me, 40th anniversary of Glacier View, and that's all going to be up on YouTube. But I tell you what, it takes, all about this sort of stuff. This kind of work takes a long time, and if you can support me, those that are watching on PayPal, it really, really helps. Spending hours a week getting that material ready for YouTube. And also, I'm offering a free song. If you click this link, just go peterdixon.gumroad.com and follow the link there to a free song. And I've also had a lot of people inquiring about our podcast season 1, because season 1 is only available on the podcast platform. And I've put a link in the description, so you should be able to see that. Click that. And the first 3 interviews are with Des. So a little note about that, Gillian. It's sad that Des never got to hear those interviews. We did them, and it took ages for me to set up the podcast and organize RSS feeds, and by the time it was done, he'd sadly passed. So that was one regret I had. I really was hoping he got to hear those. But anyway, that is life. Let's get started, Gillian. I will click the button here, click the button there, and I'm reading this one.
Let me read this one, and then you can be me in the next one.
Sounds good.
Writing to Ken and Eleanor Barrett, because it's longer.
I've got a croaky voice, so I'll have a little drink while you're reading.
Okay, this is to Dr. Russell Standish, Austin Hospital, Heidelberg, Victoria, 10th of May, 1976. My dear Russell, and this is from Des. Thank you so much for your recent letter. Let me assure you that there is no man whose moral character I esteem more highly than yours. For this reason, I am highly puzzled by your present conduct. I have plainly declared to you that it is not my teaching and never has been that the Bible contains millions of errors. Furthermore, I've reminded you that the tape at the division office says no such thing. That tape would be available for your listening if you wished, and I counsel that you listen to it for yourself inasmuch as you were absent from the day's proceedings. Furthermore, on that tape, when Brother Burnside declared it was my teaching that the Bible was shot through with errors, I publicly denied the accusation, and that accusation, I reply, is very clear on that tape. Now, Russell, it puzzles me that you should continue to say publicly things that I have denied both in public and to you in correspondence. This does not seem to be right. Furthermore, you claim that I do not believe in Ellen White. That also is inaccurate. You may freely say that Des Ford does not interpret Ellen White the way you do, but that is another thing. To say that I do not believe in Ellen White as a special prophet from God for this church is just not true, and I appeal to your conscience not to repeat what is not true. Third, you declare in public that I do not believe in sanctification. I'm sure on thinking about this, you must also realize that this is false. I have hundreds of students every year. Every one of them could tell you how I practically try to make the doctrine of sanctification, applying it to their eating habits, their working habits, their resting habits, all their habits, to show that I've gone on record in print in the Signs of the Times in such works as Exploring God's Treasury, and in scores of sermons to the effect that I wholeheartedly believe in the demands of sanctification. How then can you make such claims as you do? Furthermore, I would remind you that when you yourself heard me preach a series on this, you declared, I agree with all of that. You furthermore went on to protest, to ask why Pastor Frame did not stop those old men who were making such unreasonable complaints. Russell, I appeal to you for your own sake, for the Church of God's sake, that you consider carefully what things you say and whether the Spirit of God can approve them. I've been teaching for many, many years in these areas. I've never said such things as you accuse me of. You cannot be free before God and repeat such things in the face of my denial and the abundant evidence in print and on tape of the truthfulness of my denial. In fact, I believe that to be clear before God, a public retraction is called for in order to undo the harm that you have done. Be assured, I bear you no personal ill will. I think the world of you as a Christian brother. I must confess my bewilderment at your present conduct. With the warmest of regards, sincerely yours, Desmond Ford. But he kept on saying it, and you remember that Des responded to one of Parmenter's letters, which would be probably 3 years later, accusing him of the same thing.
And
so what do you think of that?
Yeah, powerful and interesting the Standish brothers, within the context of their involvement with the Concerned Brethren, were largely the engine room of propelling them along with such articulate, intelligent communication. Not accurate, but they were the reason this Concerned Brethren made such inroads, I believe, that led right to all around America, all around the world. They were
They sort of
very influential.
They were working on different fronts. Russell and Colin were working on the nature of Christ, righteousness by faith issue. But if you listen to the debates where they speak or read what they write, they had a very works righteousness. It was a bald works righteousness approach that very few ministers in the church would have believed. And of course, George Burnside was going off on a number of things, but certainly thousands, tens of thousands of his Dr. Ford's dangerous doctrines went around America. And Des faced that every weekend, wherever he went. The place being littered. There was a huge networking. Now, none of these men, even though the division in 1970 had called Des in 3 times, and Des always won when he was there, these men really never got rebuked, especially in America. And the main reason is because they were in touch. Russell Standish was in touch with Pearson and so on, and had an ear because R.H. Pearson believed what they did. In fact, his letter, I think I've got it here, on the Thursday afternoon it was read out. I've talked to Gilbert about this, and he agrees that the ideas in it are based on material from the Standish brothers.
Yeah. So
Des got, he certainly got, in the end he was disfellowshipped, and after 1983 they repeatedly tried to remove our membership. But the Standish brothers and the Concerned Brethren in Australia, even though they were saying things that were just not true, were never rebuked.
No. And still to this day, you'll have leadership criticise Des's ministry, but they're very cautious about saying anything negative about that group of Concerned Brethren and the spin-offs. And the Standish brothers started, was it Heartland in America? And
yes,
you can
first
trace
on the
back.
West Coast.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure they called it Weimar.
There was something to do with Hart.
And Heartland was on the East Coast in New England.
Yeah, and they started that, and you could trace every fundamentalist Christian independent organisation back through to Heartland and to the Standish Brothers and the Concerned Brethren, even though a lot of Americans like to claim that the fundamental opposition to Des was from America. But it's clearly the Standish Brothers were the 2 main opponents, fueled by finance and rhetoric of the Concerned Brethren. But if it wasn't for the Standish Brothers, there'd be a whole different scenario would have played out. But it's all about the authority of Ellen White being challenged. And Des, in that letter, sounds quite aligned to Adventism. When he, in his later years, would he have still claimed that Ellen White was a prophet? In that letter, he did. But that was, of course, 1980.
He was not he was a fundamentalist in his early days. He still highly regarded her. And, I've talked about his work doing his thesis, where she went along in the early chapters of Great Controversy. She went along with what the men were teaching, but in the 600s, she was ahead of them and quite different to them. And, I've known other people who've done higher study who found that Ellen White had insights that are quite scholarly and it's hard to find where she got them from.
Yeah.
But in the end, you know, I mean, Des and I were an Adventist, and we came in and we remained respectful of Ellen White and think she gets, I mean, Des gets just as much bad press from ex-Adventists as Ellen White does.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just not fair when you hear the best authorities. But Des said in the end, look, if you've got a problem with Ellen White, she said, the Bible and the Bible only. If you've got a problem with her, you don't have to use her. That was his approach. But I mean, he did keep her books and he did read them. And it wasn't a sentimental tie, it was intellectual.
Yeah.
He respected her.
And I made a mistake there. I said that letter was 1980, but it was 1976. Okay, so tell me about the one I'm going to read now. This is from
this one is
in Eleanor Barrett.
Now, this is in Washington, D.C., August the 27th, 1980. And because of this letter, we know when the second Prexad meeting took place, because I mentioned that Des was in it while I was writing the letter. So we're back in Washington, very busy because we had contacts from all around the world. I don't know how people found us. And this letter is important. Well, that's one reason, because it tells you that the 22nd was the second Prexad meeting. And then the third one was on September 2. And that's where Prexad decided to defrock Des, when you're looking at how Des was judged. And we've talked about this. We're going to talk about it more. It won't be this week, but when we're talking about 1983, it comes clear how it was all sort of planned, that America would fire Des, but then Neil Wilson asked Parmenter to call the committee together, the executive committee, on September the 15th, and that's where the executive committee voted to fire Des. And I've mentioned this before. Neil Wilson sent a cassette and said they must do it, and 4 or 5 people wouldn't do it. Eric Magnuson, Bob Parr. I think it was Ray Swanell, who was an elder over in West Australia, who just didn't think it was fair. He was quite conservative. John Carter, and there was somebody else who I can't remember. But anyway, one of the useful things about some of these letters is that when you don't know when something actually happened, like that second Prexad meeting, is contained in the letter. So that's one thing. But it also shows the uncertainty. There had been talk of us, talked about on the floor at Glacier View, that we'd be going to Europe. And I told you that we'd had a meal with Walter Scragg when he came over for the Dallas GC. And even though he didn't say much, the way he talked, I said to Des, he's going to try and save you by giving you a job in Europe. And then Jack Castle, this is how you put all your sources together, he wrote a written interview with Trevor Lloyd, and he mentions that the idea of Des going to Europe, actually to the New Gallery, to be the evangelist in London, came from Walter Scragg. Of course, Walter Scragg later denied it in a workers' meeting, said it was never planned, but it was. So anyway, here it shows that we still don't know whether we're going to England or not.
Right.
Now, the September 2 meeting, they called in these extras. I wasn't there, but I know that Ken Wood, Arthur White, and Herb Douglas were put on that committee, and they decided Des was too much of a heretic to send anywhere. So that was scrapped.
Okay, well, I will read this one. And is that showing your end there? So this is Jill to Ken and Eleanor Barrett from Washington, D.C., August 27, 1980. Here we go. Dear Ken, Eleanor, and Fiona, got your message on giving you information on what has happened. Have been besieged by phone calls, letters, etc. So I'll have to necessarily be brief. And waiting for Des to come home to tell us if things are being resolved. This must have been the second, and this is your comment you've added here, this must have been the second meeting of Prexad to discipline Des in Washington, D.C. This is just after Glacier View, isn't it?
That finished on the 15th.
Yes, that's literally a week later. And if we are going to the new gallery, if so, it will be a bit of a blow for Ray Stanley, who has done all he can to oppose Des while in England at the new gallery. Things are in tension. Des still have...
There's some typos.
Des still has to give some assurance to the Australasian men, and it depends on how much he has to repent as to whether we go or not. If not, we will probably be going to self-supporting work with Zane Kim. Is that how you pronounce it? Or Kim? Okay, I haven't heard you talk much about him. We'll have a little chat about that in a moment. We are in a difficult spot since RDB, and that's Brinsmead, has already sent out materials on a new church structure here and in the West. 2 churches have pulled out already and gone congregational. Because of this, and because Des does not wish to cause a split, he is trying to bend backwards to stay in at this point. He has told Bob Brinsmead he will not work with him, at least told Jack Zweimer. There are many who would not understand it if Des did, and it would seem to prove that there has been continual collusion between the two, which is not true. There has been no collusion. Over here, there are a lot of lay people ready to pull out, so the situation is very tricky. Jack called... Is this an added comment, or is this in brackets in the letter?
Added comment.
Jack called Des when we were traveling back to California from Washington, D.C. after September 2 in someone else's car. Don't know how Jack contacted us. I don't recall anything else about that trip, except that Jack offered Des perks to work with Verdict, not a job. He wouldn't have done it anyway. Back to the letter.
That's not correct. It must have happened on the way from Glacier View, because I mention it in this letter, has already happened. So we must have driven home to Washington from Glacier View, and Jack Swain found us at a hotel. I have no idea how people found us, but they did. So that happened on the way to Washington, not on the way to California. I will have to change that.
Right, it's good. We're kind of proofing volume 3. I told Des that I want the thing resolved as soon as possible, since Luke is due to start school next week and we need to settle down somewhere. Well, what happened at Glacier View? On the last Friday morning, the whole group met together and went over 3 statements which will appear in the September 4 review. They read it through and then went over them page by page to see if clarification was needed anywhere. The first statement was the consensus of the group on the biblical problems, or at least by group, did you mean the whole group or the group there on the Friday? That everyone gathered at the whole Glacier View, or just the people there on the Friday?
Where it was read out was the full assembly, but the small groups. And if you look in the ministry, it's about page 20. I can't remember exactly. It gives you those small groups. It gives you who was in which committees. So if you want to look it up, you look in the October ministry, which you can download.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
So the first statement was the consensus of the group on the biblical problems, or at least what the group thought was present truth on the sanctuary topic. Des was very happy with this statement. It was more than he had hoped for, though not perfect, of course. However, it had several advances of previous positions. The statement number 2 on Ellen White was all right, I think. Statement 3 was made up by a group of 6 people: Raoul Didron, Norman Young, Arthur Furch, Jim Londis, Bob Spangler. I don't know the other one. I think it was Herbert Douglas. Norman was a true friend to us while there. Had a great time with him. Didn't see much of Arthur Furch. He and Des had a couple of interchanges over Daniel. Arthur didn't see eye to eye with him on some things there and felt he had misquoted him. Des still thinks he didn't. And then you've added, Des told me recently, 2018, that there was a secretarial error in the Glacier View manuscript, which was put together very fast, especially end. And that's I've got the 3 of those here that were sent out. I want to come back to that too, because I've got a question about that. And I guess you're saying there that Furch may have read something that was actually a bit of a secretarial error as well.
Well, that's what Des told me. Andrew's has a different opinion, but I did ask Des, because we did a lot of talking about Glacier View, doing videos on it.
Anyway, on the Friday afternoon at 4 p.m, we were called in. I chickened out at first, but came back after an hour and heard the last half. The first part was mainly a recital of Des's faults. Understandable why administration would feel that way. Said Des was intransigent, stubborn, divisive, had poor judgment, etc. Talked about the irresponsibility of the October 27, 1979 meeting and its aftermath. Des is not insisting to Brinsmead that he not circulate the tapes, etc. Note, in 2007, I investigated who sent out the tapes, and RDB and Verdict did not send any out at all. The figure of 50,000 was quoted by Neil Wilson, and Des was visibly pleased, which did not go over well. In fact, it never happened. It was fictional, probably said by John Brinsmead to Keith Parmenter, and not disclosed to us. Excuse me. When I came in, so now back to the letter. When I came in, they were discussing the consensus statements. This was written by Bill Johnson mainly, with Duncan Eva, Fritz Guy, and Dick Lesher on his committee. And then you've added, Bill recently said Gerhard Hassel helped write it. Hassel, sorry, helped write it. These men were not in the Prexad meeting, however. As I say, Des thought it, this is the consensus, was a great improvement. Told the committee Friday PM this, but they couldn't believe it. They said they saw the consensus and Des's manuscript was separated by a deep gulf. Des said he would live with it and preach it with the exception of a few minor details. This they could not accept. Thus, one of the requirements in the drafted letter, which was read later, reflected this. Des must not only agree to be quiet on the issue, but must say he was in error in his manuscript. Paper 3, the 10-point statement, was then looked at, and Des must preach what the statement of fundamental beliefs taught on Adventist beliefs. The letter I referred to in the last sentence was read later. You've added there. They asked, did it represent Des's position correctly? And he said it did, except for the first statement, which alleged that he used various statements indiscriminately and without context.
And by the way, Des said they never, ever, then or later, ever brought up the evidence of where he had used things out of context.
That's
and
right.
Of course, you can read the manuscript yourself and judge for yourself.
This document 3 was an opinion paper. It had no evidence with it. It was not intended to be used in the way it was said some of the non-attending committee. Neil Wilson said this was evidence that the whole group was against Des's ideas, with maybe the exception of a couple of individuals. He said the scholars were all against him. Then the draft letter was read out. It was more rigorous than the final typed copy, although Keith Parmenter told us when he handed us number 2 letter that though it had been rephrased, it was essentially the same in meaning. I told you before what was one requirement. Another was to come out publicly against Brinsmead in the review. On those 2 points, especially the saying that he was in error and preaching a traditional view, Des could not capitulate. He said, "Are you asking me to lie?" KP said, "No, but if you can't affirm these statements, I shouldn't have to ask you for your credentials. You should give them to me." They said they would give us a couple of weeks to think it over, but Des said, "We don't need time. On these conditions, my answer is final." At that point, Des's employment was sundered. Anyone who says different must be wearing blinkers, I think. I think KP expressed his regret and told us that we would not be left high and dry in the USA and that he would talk to us later about this. I made a rather passionate speech, crying the whole time, the only tears I've shed on this matter, I assure you. We all shook hands and the others left. KP told us we would get 6 months' wages and our airfares paid back to Australia. He said he couldn't see Des working in the SHF and asked what would Des do. We didn't know. I mention this so that you can see it was final. We hear KP is now saying that we misunderstood what was said. I ask you. Poor old Arthur Duffy, as he was walking out, put his head on Des's shoulder and just wept and wept. Why, if Des's employment had not just been, terminated? I think that KP thinks I was the one who let the cat out of the bag in Australia. I only told Noel Mason on the west coast of the USA and was very positive. They treated us decently, and coming from their point of view theologically and administratively, one can understand what and why it happened. When I say I only told Noel, he was the only Australian I talked to, but I was not negative towards KP, and I don't quite know why everybody in Australia is so hostile towards him. It was well known in the next couple of days that KP, i.e. the Australian division, was the compelling force behind what happened on Friday. The GC regretted it, I think, and are doing all they can to remember the situation by getting Des sent elsewhere. But all the rumours we are hearing back show the administration being defensive and telling it all somewhat differently to what we felt happened. It is still a fine and tense line as to whether we go to England and stay in the ministry. We would have gone, and this is your comment now, more recently, we would have gone if that had been the decision made, but in the post-Glacier View Prexad meeting that I speak of, the third on which took place on September 2, Des attending at the beginning of this letter, they had stacked the committee with Kenneth Wood, Arthur White, Herb Douglas, at least, and they all decided Des was too much of a heretic to send anywhere. So the idea of going to London was scotched. KP tried to insist that Des had resigned, according to rumours, but Des went there with no intention of resigning, and it was just the rigidness of the letter which he could not affirm, and therefore had to say no. Excuse me. With the mention of financial remuneration, etc., it certainly seemed permanent to us. We're getting a lot of sympathy, but don't need it. We're not heartbroken. Such situations teach one a lot about human nature, one's own and others. I really feel sorry for Keith Parmenter. He has had a rotten go from beginning to end in that job, and the old men have worn him down for a long time. No wonder he would like to be rid of Des Ford. And now he has to bear the brunt of this situation with the hostility of people who defend us. The whole thing is a very difficult situation. A lot depends on whether we can hold on for a couple of years. With Bill Johnson going into the review, there is a great gleam of hope in a dark night. Also, despite the negatives about Des Ford, time will redeem at least some of what he has tried to do. Ray Cottrell has written on an article for the Next Spectrum on what happened at Glacier View, and it ends with a very nice statement about Des. However, with the agitation of Robert Brinsmead and many lay people's dissatisfaction about administration and the issues, the thing may explode before enough time goes by to help the situation. Please be careful what you say from this letter. Our attitude towards Keith Parmenter is very positive. He made a very nice speech earlier in the week on Des's behalf. His error has been to think that administration can hold a tight rein and expect the laity to just accept what he has done without quibble. Those days are fast passing. Lots of love to you both and our friends, Jill and Des. That last little comment you made there, those days are fast passing. 42 years later, identical.
That's the same.
Nothing's changed. And you've just said, we now hear that we won't know for a week at least what is happening. Read the new gallery.
See that now? That's written just after Glacier View, so that
literally days.
For historians, that's a primary doctrine, and of course, my story now is the same as it was back then. I haven't changed. I've written, at various periods, like 18 months after, and so many years after, and it's consistent. Anyway.
It's just an interesting
so you can see that there was a chance that we were going to stay in the work and go to England.
Yeah.
I've told you, Luke had said, I don't want to go to London. Yeah. So
I'll just put up a comment that Moto Sapien wrote, which is interesting because he's saying, thanks as always for doing these. There is so much parallel with the leadership's attitude in 1980 as it was in 1888, like Jones Wagner. Leadership already made up their minds about Des regardless. So he's saying it's the same in 1888 as 1980, and then we were saying, and it's the same now as it was in 1980. So it seems like the church from the very beginning has wrestled with this problem over and over and over again. They haven't learnt from it, have they? They just keep trying to sweep it under the carpet. And
I think I've just been working on a letter, typing it out, and I'm sorry there's typos because I'm going like the speed of light.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right.
I haven't got back to proofing it. I mean, by the time the books get out, they will be in better shape. And I'm often up at 1:30, 2:30 in the morning. Type away. Hang on a minute. What was... looks like my pages are out of order. Oh, hang on a minute. Here we are. Right. It printed both sides of the pages, so I get a bit mixed up. What was I talking about? Oh, I'm working on this letter by Bob Spangler. Now, this is in 1983, after we've had the meetings with the Brethren in San Francisco that few people know about. Well, we're now looking at round 2, where they're going to take away Des's ordination. They're going to call him apostate, but not tell anybody. We certainly knew about it. And Adrian Zukoski uses the term in his article. I'm so thankful for that man. Writing an article on it in the Spectrum. I'm amazed that he knew about what was going about. But it just shows you always there's other people who know what's going on, which is why I've asked Spectrum, and they've given me permission to put half a dozen articles, whole articles from Spectrum in volume 3, because they validate what I'm telling you. Otherwise, it's just me telling you what I think happened. But when you've got the documents and you've got other people who don't really, they're not in our pocket at all, but they see the same thing. So taking away Des's ordination, calling him apostate, removing our membership, which until I started looking at what happened in 1983, I didn't realise that it was this point where Neil Wilson started calling PUC in 1983, and he did it repeatedly as every new minister came through. I've told you all about that. Until finally, when we came over here, we handed in our membership because we could no longer attend, and we knew for sure that in Queensland there'd be a huge fight. Well, we wouldn't have been allowed because the division, once you're, they'd been after our membership, we wouldn't have been allowed to move it to a church here. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. They made the decision that we were out. So, and, I go over this stuff. A lot of it is new to me as well. They don't tell you personally what's going on. You've got to work it out for yourself. So I'm sure a lot of people don't know that this is what happened to Des. And they didn't mention that they declared him apostate, which means you've left Christ, because they knew there would be people would object to it. So they didn't mention that bit.
Do you think
it happened?
In a parallel universe, if Des hadn't been kicked out and he'd kind of taken the path of a Bill Johnson that just stayed in the church and dedicated his life to soft change if possible that hasn't occurred. Do you, in that parallel universe, do you think there would ever have been a way that Des could have dovetailed the theology that you both shared with Adventism, or was there going to be a Glacier view no matter what?
Well, I think
At some point.
Des had tried, I mentioned this, that he had tried biblically to give a case to come to the conclusions that Adventism had made, but without the wrong dates and without the wrong ideas of historicism that made everything happen in the 19th century. And then we're waiting here 150 and more years for the last things to happen. And Desert, and they still, I've told you, they still haven't worked out what it was because they weren't looking. And I was just mentioning to you about this letter of Bob Spangler. We've had these meetings, and Neil Wilson has written to Des and said it's all over, and Parmenter wrote, and Ron Taylor. And then Des writes a letter, which I don't have, because that would have come from Good News. I didn't always get a copy from those. And I have the response of Bob where he's going, paragraph, page 7, blah, blah, paragraph 2, you say this. And he comes back. And you see his perspective. Your ideas, he says, your ideas don't gel with mainstream Adventism. And for many of them, this was it. The traditional view with maybe a few quirks was the message, and it could not be questioned. But they, Des, even though he was saying the investigative judgment is wrong, we know that there were many people who fell by the wayside on this. And I told you when Doug Hackelman writes his book on Cottrell, he names them all. And Des does in his Glacier View manuscript. Des was trying to provide solutions for the church that were biblical. Yeah. They could hold up their head, essentially teach the same thing. The main difference was, and it was, to me, it's so petty. We taught that Antichrist in the New Testament was the Catholic Church, and Des said it's a much bigger picture than that. If the Catholics start persecuting, they might be part of it, but it's a global, Antichrist is a global thing. That essentially, to me, was the difference between what Des was saying and what traditional Adventists were saying, with this great focus on the Catholics and hating the Catholics, which,
didn't play out, did it?
So when you read Spangler's letter, he thinks he's absolutely right, and he accuses Des of not being honest. He implies he's not honest, and he's a bit dim. And, but you can see where he's coming from. He cannot possibly think that the pioneers essentially had anything wrong about what they were teaching.
Did Des ever talk to you, like the Des and Ray and the other scholars that were on the same side? They must have looked at history and noticed from Canwright to Wagner and Jones and right up to Glacier View that every time someone tries to correct the church or bring it more back into line with the Bible, the same thing happens. The same political kangaroo court kind of scene plays out. But did they talk about that and think, why is this different now? What's that?
Des does tell the history in Glacier View of what happened. And of course, Ray Cottrell, after a day or two at Glacier View, he came to us very worried. He said it's just the same as it's always been.
And that's what I mean. What did they think? Did they think that that their approach was going to be different somehow, or do you think Ray Cottrell saying that to Des and you at Glacier View was a realization that no, this is just looping. It's going to always loop. It's never going to change.
Yeah, and we sort of knew it, but there's always this uncertainty because you're talking to people who, like a lot of people came up and talked to me. Des was elsewhere, resting, walking, being told off, walk with people. I was sort of on my own on the floor, and people came up and talked to me. And I know what a lot of people thought, like James Londis and Bob Zamora, extremely hopeful at the beginning of the week because they were quite advanced. They said, this isn't our field, but, we can see that Des is right. So hopeful. And then by the end of the week, it all went pear-shaped.
But it's interesting if you talk to most Adventist scholars today and lay people and ministers, they've all got this hope still. They're really still hopeful. In spite of the history, in spite of current trends, they're always hopeful, and it always surprises me.
Modo
sapien.
The way the church is administratively set up, it's not really going to change.
No, but this is a great hope.
His man, his last generation theology man, and at the Review and Herald, and it's going to be the 19. Bob was teaching perfectionist theology in the 60s, and then the Review and Herald with Kenneth Wood and Herb Douglas started, and perfection was being preached against by Heppenstall, Larendel, and others in America in the 60s. And then there was a reversal at the top, and you have Kenneth Wood and Herb Douglas preaching the simple nature of Christ and, character, salvation by character, and so on. And Herb, again, it's another thing that you say, okay, that sort of happened. It's sort of like Glacier View was meant to be. I've given you a list of some of the things that happened, and that's another one that in the 60s the church was teaching against perfectionism, and then in the 70s from the top it switched. But while you've got that going on, when you've got people teaching from the Review and Herald, last generation theology, not much hope for change.
No.
Ted Wilson's determined. It seems to be determined.
It is reversing. Like there was a time where people said, "Oh, behind the scenes, people believe this," but no, even behind the scenes now, it's Ted Wilson's church. Can you tell us a little bit about the guy? I've forgotten his first name. Vince Kimes, was it?
Zane Kime.
Zane, tell us a bit about him, because that was quite a profound thing you said there in that letter, they might work together.
He was a physician, and he was a person of real character. He was into natural medicine, but he had a proper medical license. And he was big on not putting any refined oils into making bread and this sort of thing. And he and Des, we were both in California, became interested and started talking to each other on that. And they got interested in the gospel. He had a very lovely wife, and they were people that I called out and talked to. And they also talked to Hamill. Hamill told Sharon Kime that they expected 70,000 to leave the church. He also told me that and said, "We don't care, we don't want them." I was absolutely horrified.
Sorry, who said the "we don't care, we don't want them"
Hamill.
again? Hamill said that.
And they called Heppenstall, I can't remember that conversation, but they called Richard Heppenstall and Hamill were the people they called. Well, they offered to put Des on the radio. They said, "Don't go back to Australia," because Des wanted to go and live on the beach. He was exhausted, absolutely exhausted.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And I mentioned one talk that I did recently that it was unfortunate that they never really talked about the purpose of Good News Unlimited, and they had a different idea. So we set up, I was running the office. I mean, I didn't have the skills to run the accounting side of it. So they got one of the board members' sisters-in-law, Marion Fritz, to come in, and she was virtually an accountant, although she hadn't done the exams, but she'd done she was excellent and a wonderful proofreader. But anyway, they kicked me out and brought Marion in. But the problem was that they had different purposes. Nothing wrong with these people at all. but they were sort of with Brinsmead, particularly Don and Bester Muth, who were on the board. That was half of the board.
Are you saying Kime was with Brinsmead as well?
Well, more Don and Bester Muth, but they were as thick as thieves. And so two married couples, which is not a good idea on the board, who were half of the board. And Vesta was in touch. I'll tell you this story so you'll understand where they came from, because ultimately they left. I can't remember when. It was after Marion came, so we'd been going for a while. But they wanted to go with the congregational idea, and the women, Sharon and Vesta, wanted Des to damn Ellen White and throw out the Sabbath. And see, he wouldn't do it. And I think by that time, or shortly afterwards, Smuts Van Rooyen had joined us from Andrews. And he wasn't interested in congregational system because he said the congregation is worse than administration when it comes to the pastor. For instance, our congregation in Auburn, California at the time, wanted to, after the sermon, to all sit around and critique the sermons. And Smuts said, absolutely not. So there was a difference of purpose. And so they ended up moving out because Des, he was quite set. He didn't want to start a new church. I mean, he knew what it would involve. Des was not interested in administration. He was a teacher. He did do a lot of pastoral work as a bypass, but, you know, and the thing is that a lot of time you get the people who are disaffected over one thing or another, and they don't always have the right spirit. Now, I'm not talking about the Kimes and the Muths. No. But among the population. And so the church is happy. They've got rid of all those people, what they call the, can't think of the name of it. I'll think of it afterwards. But they're a nuisance to them. They fill up all their, you know, they're glad to get rid of them. And so people now say, well, Des didn't go all the way, but Des didn't go all the way towards congregationalism and so on because for a lot of reasons.
He didn't want to.
For pastoral concern, really. And he also knew, and I've mentioned this before, that people who are perfectionists are often the accountants and the, you know, they're very careful people and they know how to run things. And people who are more liberal, they can't run, you know, they couldn't run a shop. And so you lack that structure that's so necessary for something to work. So, you know, I don't.
Plus, a lot of people like to gather around a belief that they all can agree on, and they spend a lot of time defining what that belief is. And then people go, well, I don't agree with that, so I shouldn't stay. And the traditional congregational idea or break off church, I doubt would have worked. Can I ask a question, just changing the topic a little bit, but from something you said last week? So here are the 3 books that were given out to those at Glacier View. And there's a bunch of these original manuscripts that are floating around there. And you said something last week, and I'll just, about someone had put a summary book together of the manuscript, the Glacier View manuscript. And I just was chatting to my good friend Adrian this week, and we were trying to work out, is it this? I'll just show you the picture of it. Is this the one that is the summary book?
No, that is actually, that is the Glacier View manuscript, which was published by Doug Moorhead in Florida.
Right.
But he got his brother to proofread it, and it's got loads of typos in it.
But that was from the 3 books I held up, put into one book. So what's the other book you talk of then? What's the other one you're talking about?
Oh, there was a PDF which is available from the Desmond Ford website, which was put together by Angus McPhee and his son.
Right.
And it was done from the 3-volume set, so it's very accurate.
Right.
And I then republished it using that PDF. I took all the text out and reformatted the whole thing, turned it from Australian, they'd put it in Australian spelling and everything. I changed it all back to American and republished it as 3 volumes, just the same as you've got, with the appendices for each. It's sort of 2 chapters, 2 chapters, 2 chapters, 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and 3 and 4. And then the appendices that belong to each set of 2 chapters are, this is in the one I republished in 2014.
Yes. And that's the one, that's done with the Glacier view. Sorry, with the Glacier and Des.
With Des on the front. Another miracle.
Yeah, that's right. And they're still available. Yeah,
look, I have these. I've got to tell you, I have these. Were you finished?
No, I don't forget what you're going to say though. I just, there was something though you said last week that someone, you don't know who it was, they said it was you, had put together something and released.
Family interview, which is in volume 3. Now this is an article written, and funnily enough, I had some, and I only have 1 set of these, but when I worked at Good News Unlimited, we had a newsletter, and it was very unsophisticated. Just had a, so there's 2 pages 3 and 4, where I'm telling what's happening with Des. Now they are going in volume 3 as well. You know, this is a sampling of documents to show what was going on. So in there, it mentions this fairly firmly article. And so it was published in 1981. I thought it was 1985 or 86. So I had to move it in the book 5 years earlier. And I say in there that it wasn't done by Des or me. It was written by a scholar from the East, meaning from Andrews, and I have no idea who it was. It's very, very clever, but I just sent it to Milton to look at, and he said, oh, it's a lot of hard work. He doesn't like things that are complicated, but the arguments, it's very clever.
Right. Okay, well, shall we get back to the letter?
It's a go at Gerhard Hasel, is what it is.
Right. Okay, well, I misunderstood a bit of that last week, so thanks for clarifying that.
Hope I've made it clear.
Yeah, no, that's good.
So now we've got, this is Des's explanation, and it's just, I've retyped it. There's probably errors in it again. I don't know when it was published, probably between 1980 and 1981, where Des is explaining, and I've got no idea where it came from. It's sort of like, I've got 2 pages of it, whatever it is. I've been asked on more than 1 occasion in recent years, and especially since the October 27th forum on the sanctuary, so it might have been in early 80, before Glacier View, to explain my relationship with Robert Brinsmead, and have been encouraged to write a definitive statement against him for publication in our church papers. You remember Parmenter asked them to do that. I have consistently refused to do this, which has led to great suspicion among administration of my relationship with him. In the decade when Bob was at Avondale, I recall sitting in the faculty seats on the platform of the Avondale Chapel, and after the meeting, I noticed a young man seated in the audience. I did not know him at that stage, but his face made an impression on me that he was someone marked with destiny. This was Bob Brinsmead. When in the 60s he began to teach his awakening message both here and in Australia, I was the head of the religious department at Avondale. I did not agree with Bob's theology, nor he with mine. I spent quite a deal of time in the classroom repudiating Bob's positions with my theology students. Not 1 student was lost to the awakening message, or so I believe. I also wrote over this time, first 1 book against Bob, which he responded to, and then another. I'd been asked by GC to write them. Both were submitted, though in the end neither were widely distributed. During these years, Bob and I met together, though we strongly differed doctrinally. Our interchanges then as now were almost completely on a doctrinal basis. Bob made no sallies into the brethren, dissecting them at every turn, plotting and hatching their downfall, either then or now. I say this not to commend him, but to be what I consider fair. Though we were poles apart theologically, we remained on friendly terms. In the last 10 years or so especially, I've received a lot of criticism myself, particularly from a group of retired ministers and concerned laymen, a nucleus of whom have consistently attacked me by letter, tape, and rumour. This has not been with the blessing of the administration, who in some respect have had to bear the brunt far more than I have, and have spent many long hours dealing with the situation, exhibiting great patience. This was particularly Naden and Froome. I realised that they could not have done much more than they have, since any action taken against these men in the past has been interpreted by them as persecution, which has only brought them more sympathy with their following. However, thousands of pages of material, for example, Dr. Ford's Dangerous Doctrines, have been littered from Alaska, where I went to take camp meetings, to the Mexican border, and from coast to coast USA. Many tapes making personal attacks have been circulated. Many letters of accusation have been written over a long period to people in key positions, and many rumours have been circulated. Not only have I been accused of satanic heresy, but my motives have been impugned and my honesty questioned. Just one, for example, is fairly typical. 2 more errors. And when I put my paper up like that, it affects the microphone. I can hear it sort of gurgling. So I have to look out to the side. Jill, in 1977 forwards, Irwin Gain visited every board member of PUC and spoke to anybody who would listen. He also wrote to the local ministry, for example, those in the Bay Area of California. Back to the letter, to Des's notes. To each of these great exaggerations of my doctrinal views were made. We arrived in America and initially constantly faced a barrage of rumours that we were Brinsmeadites. Didn't believe in the law. Didn't believe in Ellen White. To the group of whom this instance is an example, but not isolated, I am considered Antichrist. I've been called this on a regular basis by some. Mud that is slung will cake and dry. Some is always left. The repetition of the same rumour a few times will breed prejudice as impenetrable as a thick black wall through which no light will pierce. I mention this to illustrate a principle which I've tried, not always successfully, to follow. I believe it's mandatory to a Christian to extend the golden rule to others, even to one's enemies. Therefore, though I've been tempted 1,000 times to retaliate in like vein with certain of this group, I've tried to remain objective and deal with issues, not with personalities. Those in the Australasian division who have had to deal ad nauseum with an overly militant section of this group would agree, I think, that some of their positions could be easily toppled, leaving them looking rather foolish, since I believe the majority of thinking people in the States would not agree with them anyway. But I've tried to remain urbane, leaving them looking rather foolish, since I believe the majority of thinking people in the States would not agree with them anyway. Anyway, I've repeated a bit in there, so dear me, haven't done a good job, Jill. The way I have dealt with these men is the same principle I use in handling differences with others, including Bob Brinsmead. I will not get involved in what I feel would be an imbroglio based on political reasons, not doctrinal ones. I would oppose him on where he uses the Bible in a way which I cannot accept, and 2, blatant disloyalty to the Adventist Church. I would like to list some factors which I think important to this discussion. There is a great deal which Bob teaches, which I believe. I think he's made significant strides doctrinally and Christologically from the previous positions he's held. On his sanctuary position, some of the problems which he has illustrated, I've been aware of for many years. I would want to express differently the resolutions, but I'm also aware that many of the church's scholars who are also aware of these problems would have varying answers, where people think expression is not necessarily or desirably exactly the same. As Jim Cox said at the first meetings on this present topic, he plans to write up some of the different models which various ones of our scholars have proposed. There is not unanimous agreement. C. The essence of my views on the sanctuary I've taught for years and was expressed in my Xerox book, Daniel 8:14, The Judgment and the Kingdom of God, which has been openly available for anyone who wishes to purchase it for a long time. It needs to be said that when I returned from the seminary in 1961, I talked about this to Pastor David Sibley, who also was aware of the problems in Hebrews, since he'd been on W. Fletcher's committee. I asked him, what should I do? Should I tell the students the problem and help to resolve them, or what? He told me to tell them the truth. So I've taught over the 16 or so years at Avondale about the problems. I've tried to give them positive answers. This can be easily verified. I believe that the young men I've taught these things to have not been traumatized or their faith shattered, and have and are making a positive contribution to the church body. I have been told, not by Bob's followers, that he learned of some of the problems by reading that book. My contacts with Bob in America have usually been brief. He usually rings me when he comes to America. I see him infrequently when he comes through. We occasionally correspond, but it is occasionally. Since October 27, 1979, I've received no communication from him except one phone call. The essence of our contact is on doctrinal issues. Again, occasionally we hear from Jack Swamer in Georgia, but it's true that we go for quite some months hearing nothing from them. E. I've not been asked permission to circulate my thesis or tapes. In my opinion, when something is in print or on tape, it's out for grabs. In my estimation, Bob's work is almost totally outside Adventism. He has a work of a magnitude beyond anything else I know of for non-Adventists by Adventists. Where he speaks for Adventist audience, tapes mainly, I believe that our way to handle this is to provide better pasture if we feel he is sheep stealing. Many of those who follow Bob are a good quality of Adventists, faithful to Ellen White, committed to Bible study, and better informed than some of our ministers. As to a relationship between him and me, apart from the discussions and interests I've mentioned, Bob has his work and program. I have mine. Rarely the twain shall meet. F. I have to consider whether Bob is motivated by Satan or if his work has the imprimatur of the gospel on it. It's too easy for us to wipe out a man's work with one stroke of the pen or a few short words. But we must remember that living in the light of the judgment and eternity, we would never want to be found opposing Christ. We need to realize that he has thousands of non-Adventist ministers subscribing to his journal. He is having considerable impact. And this is the line. I would not want to improve my own situation by damning Bob and his work as of Satan. In summary, I believe that the church must handle this and associated problems intelligently, honestly, and spiritually. They must question what the facts are, not react through fear and prejudice. If we have the truth, we have nothing to fear. Do you think that's great? I do.
That summarizes it very well, doesn't it? It's the
So
first.
I don't know where it comes from. It was just 2 loose pages.
Wow.
3 loose pages.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah. Well, that's good because that gives an assessment from Des's own mouth.
I mean, people got the
what
idea.
he was thinking.
People who think that Des and Bob were in each other's pockets, they don't understand. You know, I've been talking to Bob recently. I was not in cahoots with him in 1980, but since Des has died, I have been in touch with him, often to check up on historical details. And he highly regards Des for his character and his kindness. He said, Des was so kind to me, and which many people were not. They were dreadful to Bob. But he said, as for his ideas, he said they were, what did he say? Ridiculous. And Bob's always been like that. He's been his own man with his own ideas.
Yeah.
And, Des is just another one of the fools. People don't understand this. And he says it to me. What
I like about Bob is that he can differentiate with someone's ideas and beliefs and still be friends with them. And I think Des was the same.
To me, when I'd been around Bob, or he wrote me an email once telling me about John Brinsmead and his involvement. He speaks. The family looked on him as a prophet.
Yeah.
He has that way about him where he speaks as a prophet with great authority.
Are there recordings of him? I've read a lot of his actual material, and I've interviewed him, of course, but I'm saying back in the day, are there recordings that survive of him during that plane truth? Was it
there probably is.
If someone watching,
Mac would be the one. He's the one who knows about.
So if Fleetwood's watching, or anyone else can send me a link in the comments, just tag me of any recordings of Bob speaking during this era that we're talking about.
And by the way, Bob has read my 2 volumes.
Oh, right. What did he think?
He liked them.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't say if he didn't, put it that way. But he was surprised at Heppenstall's behaviour at Glacier View. And he's written me an email, and I've sent that to Gilbert Valentine, because ultimately Gilbert will write this up in some way. Because Bob had a meeting with Heppenstall, and he can't remember when it was, but it was sometime in 1978.
All right.
Gilbert thinks it was quite early. But he talked to Heppenstall. He was reading, I think it was probably late 1978 myself. So he goes to visit Heppenstall at Carmel on, Central California on the coast. And he might have called Des, or I think he came by. I've got a vague memory. Des couldn't remember him actually coming, but I think he actually came to visit us after he visited Heppenstall. And according to him, I could, not on this computer, but somewhere I will publish what Bob says. Heppenstall questioned the investigative judgment, and Bob told him the whole history of it, because Bob is very good at the early history. He's he could get a PhD without trying in the early history of the church. He told him how it developed. And Heppenstall was quite against it. So Bob was quite against at what happened at Glacier View.
Yes, particularly if that was before Glacier View that he was saying that.
And so he then went and talked to Des, and Des said, look, Bob, I've got enough on my plate without talking about that. And this wasn't something, but Des knew Bob had to be answered. So Bob went home and started writing his book, 1844 Re-Examined. He thought it would only taken him 2 weeks. And he thought that when it got to verdict, it would have taken 1 or 2 months. And it was published in July 1979. Another of these providential things that it comes out, and Des is going around every weekend speaking around the country. And he's asked about it because there are always Brinsmeadites who came along to hear the gospel. And Des always felt like Dale Ratzlaff, the church never wrote a book about the Sabbath, but Des did, the Forgotten Day. And Des thought Bob needs to be answered. And so this is why when it came to the forum in October, and he was asked if he would take this meeting, but it was basically because Bob had written this book.
Right.
That's why Adrian...
1844 Re-Examined.
Yeah.
Right.
And even though they say Des said yes, he didn't say yes immediately, but they said you'll be protected because it's forum. You can say anything in forum, which didn't turn out to be true.
No, it didn't turn out to be true at all.
But that's sort of history with Bob.
Next time you talk to Bob, tell him I'd love another interview with him. soon.
Right. Yeah. I did ask Doug Hackelman. He said next year.
Oh,
He's
great.
totally
He's working.
involved.
That'll be great, because if
on
we
his
get
Cottrell.
Doug on board, we can talk about the Cottrell book when it's finished.
I hope we're not going off the track too much.
No, it's good. And someone's just said about Bob. Yes, we're talking about Bob Brinsmead.
Brinsbean, I like that.
Yes, little spelling there.
Got a D on the end.
Brinsmead. Just back to the Kime guy. What happened to him in the end? He'd be passed now, I guess.
Now they thought he died. He was a mountain climber, amateur mountain climber, and he was coming back from a climb, and he fell down the slope and he got killed.
Wow.
It was terrible.
What year was that? Was he still involved with GNU at the time?
No.
Wow.
I'd have to look it up. I'd say 1986, but I'm not sure. It could have been earlier. It was terrible. But he was in trouble himself as a doctor. What's the medical board? The M something or other. Can't think of it. They were after him. They tried to sue him. And there were 3 alternative physicians who were doing natural medicine, and they were after Zane, and somebody thought that it was highly conspiratorial. His wife didn't think so, but and she ultimately went to San Francisco and did law. A very clever lady, became a barrister.
And is she still alive?
I don't know.
Interesting to try and track it down. We've got some great sleuths here in SDAQ&A. See if we can track that down. Now let's get to the next letter. This is you reading.
No, this is you.
No, anything from Des you have to read.
No, this one's Robert Pearson, isn't it?
Oh, my one's come up that it's
page 11.
To Parmenter from Des.
Maybe you're looking at an old version.
It says revised version.
It's supposed revised too, but it looks like I might have to read it then.
Well, I'm happy to jump to the Pearson one if you prefer. I think that's is that an appeal to the Sanctuary Review Committee?
This is the letter that was read out on the Thursday.
Oh yes, I've been wanting to hear this.
Then we've got it.
And then we go. I'll just go with your guidance here. So I'll read the appeal to the Sanctuary Review Committee, Glacier View, Colorado, read out August 14, 1980. This is a fabulous one. I've heard snippets of this, but this is the actual one that Neil would have read out in the assembly, wouldn't he?
So remember, these are in date order, and I thought there weren't a lot of letters during Glacier View, but there was this one.
Yeah. No, let's do this one because the next one is September, and this is actually August. Perfect.
The next one is Larry Geraghty. Oh no, this is the one from Andrews, the Andrews, and that letter is a beauty.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll read this one out now. That was read.
So, do you want me to tell you a little bit about it?
Yes, tell us a bit about it.
On the Thursday, because Pearson couldn't be there, he was the former, Neil Wilson came in, he had to retire because of ill health, and he couldn't go to Glacier View because it was 9,000 feet up. And so he, like others, had sent letters to Hamill or to the group, and they chose to read this out. Now, this was read out to the full assembly in the afternoon at Glacier View. And this changed the tide. Tuesday night at Glacier View, where Heppenstall got up and challenged Des about the judgment in Daniel 7. And then when Neil Wilson came in and sort of took over and said to Des, you don't listen that. That caused a huge emotional furore. But this one on the Thursday, changed the tide, because afterwards all the administrators from around the world, amens all around the room. Now, we were never given a copy of this letter. Somehow Jill's got hold of it. A friend in archives, I'd say. And I think this is the one that was read out. I remember a couple of things that are different.
Right.
So there may be more than one version.
And this is also, Pearson was the president before Neil Wilson. And I think in my interview in season 2 with Lyndon Rogers, he talked about a letter that had been discovered written between the two of them before Glacier View, where they were being very clear that they wanted Glacier View to be a line in the sand about the whole issue, and that they felt it was time to put an end to the questioning of the authority of Ellen White. I must watch that interview again to get
a very good one,
an accurate appraisal of what was said. But that is such a boy. If you're only going to watch 5 interviews of season 2, that would be one of them. Okay, I will read that letter. Let's get it up on the screen again. So this was from the retired General Conference President, R.H. Pearson, and it was read out at the Thursday afternoon full assembly, 14th of August 1980, to resounding amens around the room. So that's interesting. Des was not given a copy of it, nor was he allowed to respond to it. So there was would the resounding amens have come from the scholars as well, or from the other administrators?
No, it was administrators.
Yeah, wow. So that kind of vibe. I remember we did the interview with you, and we listened to the tapes of Keith Parmenter and Athol Tolhurst only a month after their return at the ministers' meetings. And that kind of resounding amen, brother, giving a verbal support of Keith and Athol was kind of in the air as well in those recordings. They're in season 2 as well, I think. Okay, the letter that was read out. It has been a personal disappointment for me not to be with you leaders there in Glacier View for this important study and discussion session. For a number of reasons, this has not seemed feasible. However, our thoughts and prayers are with you as you wrestle with some of the doctrinal issues before God's remnant church at this time. Your gathering may well prove to be one of the historic convocations of Adventism that could influence the course of the church doctrine and polity until the return of our Lord. For the past several weeks, I've been reading hundreds of manuscript pages in an effort to keep abreast of the issues under discussion. Would he be meaning the manuscript there?
Yes, there were papers. There was one by Bill Shea, for instance, that came in at the last minute, didn't go through the committee.
Right. It is evident from these well-prepared papers that thousands of research hours and millions of amperes of brain power have been expended in preparation for this meeting. It is hoped that the results of this prodigious study have created a new awareness of the hour in which we live and have driven us all to a renewed searching of God's word in a healthy endeavor to know his will and way for his people at this time. As an appointed member of your committee, unable to be present in Glacier View, I request that you accord me the privilege of making just one speech in absentia. While mine is a voice from the past, it is the recent past. It speaks from considerable experience with dealing with some of these prickly issues for many years from a special vantage point. As I've pored over these thought-provoking papers, I've noted green lights of change flashing urgently for recognition. Now, I believe in both the reasonableness and the need for change under appropriate circumstances. The Adventist Church has made many, many changes in policy, organisation, planning and programming the past 14 years. I was in the midst of much of that change. However, there must exist valid reasons for the changes we make. We live in a day when change is in the very air we breathe, and we must not make changes merely for change's sake. Some change is good, some can be very hurtful. Therefore, as responsible leaders in the cause of God, you and I should be very much in prayer, and that any changes we propose will bring honour and glory to our Heavenly Father and prosperity to His church here upon earth. During the hours I've spent praying, studying one of the more voluminous manuscripts relating to this gathering, I have seen some amber lights and red lights flashing among the green lights of proposed change.
Now that's Des's manuscript.
Yeah, that's the one. And even the use of the word volumes, he's being slightly derogatory. Anyway, I address you today not to critique the doctrinal disputations of the largest volume or any of the other papers. There are others in your midst who are well qualified to do this, and I'm certain their voices will be heard at the appropriate time. Rather, I come to you in all sincerity to raise some vital questions and to voice some legitimate concerns that the contents of the major manuscript, which we've said is Des's, creates in my mind. Kindly bear with me as I speak to you from my heart. I was deeply concerned to discover so many. I'm just going to enlarge it a little bit. I was deeply concerned to discover so many of the distinctive truths that have made us Seventh-day Adventists under attack or questioned. The sanctuary, the spirit of prophecy, justification, sanctification, 1844, the judgment, interpretation of prophecy, the fulfillment of signs of the Advent, the second Advent itself, the nature of God, the nature of man, even the nature of salvation. Apparently, all these basics of our message are up for reassessment and possible change. I confess to you honestly, I felt a sense of nakedness, of abandonment after reading some pages of the major manuscript. Fellow leaders, have the past generations of Seventh-day Adventists and we today all been duped and misled on so many of the distinctive points of our faith for more than a century? I cannot believe it. Now, I'd like to ask a few questions that have been raised in my mind as I have read the longest manuscript. I should like to briefly explore some of the arguments advanced by the proponents of change quoted in this paper. Is our last day message to be tested by doctrinal positions held by 11 apostates from the truth who left us and who bitterly attacked the church for years? Are the Ballingers, Conradi, Canwright, the Brinsmeads and their ilk such paragons of truth and integrity that we should be influenced by their thinking today? Does it mean he's kind of lumping Des in there as well to kind of make another point? Does it mean nothing? Yeah. Does it mean nothing to us that these men wrought until untold havoc among the Church of God, and that only eternity will reveal the souls that have been lost and the sacred funds that have been misdirected as the result of their divisive actions and writings? I encourage people to go and read all about Davenport there to see about sacred funds being misdirected.
And he had a bit in that too.
That's right, and I think Wilson did too. I think they both had a little bit of some sacred fund misdirecting going on there. Not to mention, anyway, is the Advent message henceforth to be tested by the methodology, the tools, and the norms of unbelieving theologians and scientists? Is the future of the Seventh-day Adventist Church to be determined in the test tube and critics' den? Have we now come to the place that we are asked to accept the emasculated view of inspiration, so prevalent among unbelieving scholars of the world? Are we now to accept only the so-called soteriological or salvation portion of the Bible and the writings of Ellen White? What crumbs of inspiration do we have left? Little reference to you there too, I think. We are told, Ellen, with the soteriological, didn't you write a essay?
Right.
Yeah. And people were saying that Des had put you up to it. And remember, I think
they thought Des had written it.
Yes, that's right. We are told Ellen White's treatment of history is not reliable, which is demonstrable. Does this include sacred as well as secular history? Are large portions of the Conflict of Ages series to be considered historical or soteriological, safe or suspect? Where are we? Where
That
does
word's
Ellen
in
White...
there, soteriological. So
That's
yes,
right.
have a go at me.
Yeah. Where does Ellen White now fit into Seventh-day Adventist reckoning? Is she now to become only a well-intentioned but misled little old lady, a product of her times? Is hers now to become a benign pastoral role stripped of all authority? Are we wanting now to become Seventh-day Baptists and pace ourselves by their history of membership retrogression without the gift? Interesting things, a little aside there. I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that all prophets are speaking to their time and need to be taken not as an ongoing source of inspiration, but Ellen White is considered a prophet that has ongoing authority.
But he's a very gifted writer. You've got to admit.
Oh yes, and I can imagine him speaking publicly. I bet he was quite powerful. Ellen White lived contemporaneously with some who are alive today. She wrote in simple English. There is no language barrier. Do we then really need to reinterpret her writings? Isn't it more urgent that God's people follow her counsel than that we interpret it? Is it intellectually honest, firm faith in Ellen White while subtly and not so subtly attacking God's gift to the remnant church? Every citizen of our free country has the inalienable right, I knew I'd get that wrong, to believe whatever her conscience dictates to be truth. This right extends to preachers and teachers, but if the views held on such persons are at variance with the teachings of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, no preacher or teacher has the moral or ethical right to preach or teach such views in a denominational church or school while receiving his or her support from a Seventh-day Adventist treasury. That really annoys me. It is morally and ethically dishonest to accept financial support from a Seventh-day Adventist treasury while undermining the faith held by our church. I believe in intellectual honesty. I just think surely there's room for people to have individual opinions, even if they are on the payroll. Surely that's okay. In fact, I think it's a sign of a corrupt institution that says, well, we're paying you so you cannot speak your truth. Back to the letter, back to the presentation, the reading. I believe there is such a thing as moral and ethical honesty that would preclude any person accepting support from a church or school that he or she is undermining and tearing down, either overtly or covertly. Seventh-day Adventist parents send their children to our schools to receive a Seventh-day Adventist education. I know the distress and heartbreak some parents have experienced when their children were subjected to a faithless new theology. I've received many anguished letters on this subject. If a person is not in harmony with the fundamental beliefs of this church, she should be honest enough and honourable enough to reveal this fact in a forthright Christian manner and withdraw to a climate in which he feels comfortable. Let him receive his support from such a sort. To do otherwise is morally and ethically dishonest. There is academic... What's that?
That's what is morally and ethically dishonest.
That's what he's saying. Yeah.
Another accusation.
Yeah. It's a veiled attack. It's a veiled attack on Des.
Well, not too veiled. But to me, Des, was the opposite. He was morally and ethically honest.
I just don't think you or Des would. I think it's been great for you both to not have to live the rest of your lives within Adventism like many of us did. There is academic freedom. There is also academic responsibility. There must not be academic license. Many years ago, the Lord's messenger was shown a platform braced by solid timbers, the truths of the Word of God. A prominent personality in the church at the time was directing this man and that man to loosen the timbers supporting this platform. Then Ellen White heard a voice saying, "Where are the watchmen that ought to be standing on the walls of Zion? Are they asleep? This foundation was built by the master worker and will stand storm and tempest. Will they permit this man to present doctrines that deny the past?" to present doctrines that deny the past experience of the people of God. The time has come to take decided actions. Selected Messages 1, page 204. Fellow leaders, could it be possible that in our day we are witnessing a repetition of this scene? Are the words of counsel in Selected Messages words that we should ponder prayerfully today? Right here at Glacier View, the enemy of souls has sought to bring in the supposition that a great reformation that a great reformation was to take place among Seventh Adventists, and that this reformation would consist in giving up the doctrines which stand as the pillars of our faith and engaging in a process of reorganization. For this reformation to take place, what would result? The principles of truth that God in his wisdom has given to the remnant church would be discarded. Our religion would be changed. The fundamental principles that have sustained the work for the last 50 years would be accounted as error. And that's kind of true, really. And that's why I often say, let's just leave these guys to it. Stop hindering each other's move forward, and just let each group progress in freedom. The fundamental principles that have sustained their work for the philosophy would be accounted as error. A new organization would be established. Books of a new order would be written. A system of intellectual philosophy would be introduced. The founders of this system would go into the cities and do a wonderful work. The Sabbath, of course, would be lightly regarded, as also the God who created it. Nothing would be allowed to stand in the way of the new movement. The leaders would teach that virtue is better than vice, but God being removed, they would place their dependence on human power, which without God is worthless. Who has authority to begin such a movement? We have our Bibles, we have our experience attested to by the miraculous working of the Holy Spirit. We have a truth that admits of no compromise. Shall we not repudiate everything that is not in harmony with this truth? Ellen White continues, I hesitated and delayed about sending out of that which the Spirit of the Lord impelled me to write. I did not want to be compelled to present the misleading influence of these sophistries, but in the providence of God, the errors that have been coming in must be met. Fellow leaders, the Lord has brought these words from the pen of inspiration to my mind many, many times the past 15 years. I've used them over and over by voice and pen. I have been deeply impressed that they contain a message of warning to this church at this time. We should not dismiss them lightly. I urge you to read them carefully and prayerfully again and again. Brother Chairman, I want to thank you for permitting me to voice my feelings and convictions at this meeting. In closing, I want to reaffirm my faith in my Lord Jesus Christ and his saving, keeping power. I want to express again before this group of world leaders my confidence in God's remnant church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and in the message that has brought it into existence. This message and movement were heaven-born. It has been heaven-blessed, and thank God it is heaven-bound. I want to be numbered with the blood-brought throng pictured in Revelation 7:9-15. Who will blend their voices in a victorious paean of praise and thanksgiving to our God and to the Lamb. Praise God, this day of triumph is very near. There we go. And do you remember that moment of?
I do.
Was there a kind of a, as you mentioned, and I think
cheers all around?
Yeah, amazing. In the boys' club.
You know, there'd been I know his name, a black, I think he came from, I can't remember now, it's either Kenya or Nigeria, I think it's Nigeria, very highly intelligent, and he'd been a master's student at Andrews, and he used to come and talk to me every day. And he said lots of things, but I won't go into it, but he obviously understood all the issues that were going on. And he was hopeful, and then after that was read, he came out to me, and he was leaving that night. A lot of people, Heppenstall left that night. He said to me, it's hopeless.
Wow.
because of
You
that.
can't remember his name?
Abdullah Cooley or something. He's worked as an administrator in Africa.
Is
I've
he
got it.
still alive?
I finally worked out who he was because I went through. I thought, there's a list of everybody who was at Glacier View. I can work out who it was. So I found his photograph. And I actually tried to contact him, but I haven't been able to.
Boy, if you do, he'd be a great person to have a chat to, wouldn't he?
Wonderful, wonderful man. He looked like a prince. He was only a young man, but he'd come to do a master's. But look, I'd say he's one of the most intelligent people there, but it would have been working in Africa, you know.
Right.
Nobody would know him.
See if you can find out his name for me, and we'll try and track him down.
I do have it.
Just going to put a couple of comments up.
I mean, his knowledge, what he said to me was he'd just been through all the classes, and he said none of the teachers use Ellen White, and they don't believe in investigative judgment. And if it's in the class outline, they leave it till the end, and they just don't get to it. And he names people, and he said so and so used Ellen White for the first term, and then never used her again. But generally, they didn't use her. And then he said when Des came and preached, he said he was full of Ellen White. You know, he was more, you know. Anyway, it was very interesting to talk to him.
Let's track him down. Now, what's the next letter? Is this?
I didn't want to get him into trouble. I mean, he'd be. I'm trying to think how old he'd be if he was from Africa and he was doing a master's degree. I'd say he was in his 30s. I was 35. So he's now
so he'd be in his 70s.
Yeah. But he meant a lot to me because he was so honest and so knowledgeable. I can't remember, but I've often thought about him. And then I thought, I can find out his name. So I did. Being a ferret and a mole and a terrier, I went through the ministry. I thought, everybody's here. I've got to work out who it is. And I did. And then I found a photograph of him, and it was the same man.
Guy, wow. Well, shoot me a PM.
And he made an absolutely wonderful General Conference president.
I wonder what the trajectory has been for him for the last 42 years.
Wouldn't it be interesting to know?
We will research that.
Highly intelligent, godly man. As I say, to me, standing there, sort of, he'd come talk to me pretty much every day about what was going on. They were all excited at the beginning because they thought there was hope of change. But by the end, especially after that letter, they said, there's no hope.
Yeah. Was Norm talking to you much during the week? Norm Young?
I don't remember. Des, he was the only one. He'd go walking with Des. Des told me because Murdoch was there.
Oh, right.
And he'd been Des's teacher at Avondale, and then he became the dean at Andrews. And I was surprised because he actually married Des and Gwen. And I said, you never introduced us. And he said, I kept out of the way of everybody. He said, I was just so exhausted. So
after that letter was read out, did Des lean across and say anything to you?
Not that I recall, but no.
What did you feel at the time?
Doomsday.
He might have been.
When you think about it, it's very well written. He was an excellent writer. He'd written a lot of books.
Yeah.
You know, he had very little education, but he was an excellent writer, as you can see.
And
knew how to move people with words. But he's really saying nothing when you look at it. You know, Des goes there and, you know, he goes to all this trouble to write up this huge manuscript, and who read it? Very few.
On the weekend.
And even now, I know that they don't understand what it was that Des, you know, I read you that letter of Des to Parmenter where he wrote about 2 Thessalonians 2. And I'm very glad that he wrote that letter. I was looking at it again. I was going in volume 3. Because that tells you what it was that Des was trying to do.
Yeah.
You're saying, you know, Ellen White has said that all of our ideas all the things she writes about are from the scripture. He said she's come up with this idea about the last day Antichrist appearing. Now, where is that in scripture? And she explains it in Great Controversy. Now, for many people like Doug Batchelor, they sort of say, well, 1844 is the last prophecy. But Ellen White did talk about the final Antichrist. This is what got Des going, to find out what was it that Ellen White was talking about in those later pages of Great Controversy when she speaks about Antichrist. And I've told you that's why he went to Manchester, where it was a research-only thing. And F.F. Bruce said to him, when people ask you what's your contribution to knowledge, point to this on 2 Thessalonians 2, because Ellen White, it's what they call a crux interpretum, difficult text. So scholars, one thing people need to understand is scholars rarely agree, because they get, the borders of their knowledge. They often have huge differences of opinion about things. So they would have part of the picture. But Ellen White had this gestalt of what the final, what the restrainer was. And, Des found different scholars saying this and this and that. And he presented her idea of how she presented it. But that was what he was really looking at. That was, I don't know if I'm explaining it very well.
Yeah, no, that's good. Now, I'm just going to put up a little comment from people that are watching. This is Chris Lucas, live shows and call-ins. What kind of shows do you do, Chris? Can I do a call-in? I'm from America, and the SDA churches here still will walk up to you and hand her books to you and be like, isn't it incredible? She only had a 3rd grade education. She must be a prophet. Yeah, and the truth is too, Chris, that is happening more and more again here. On the weekend, someone sent me a sermon from a church here in, shall we say, Australasia. And the person sent it to me and said, this will really confirm, Ellen White and the sanctuary to you. This is just so good. And anyway, that person might be watching. I apologize for what I'm about to say, but it was just ridiculous what the person was saying. No logic, no rational thinking. It did not add up at all. But the amens, and right at the end of it, the head elder or the church pastor got up, because it was a guest speaker from the States, and they said, we're handing out free steps to Christ and Great Controversy, and away they went. The church is becoming more and more and more Ellen White centered.
Well, didn't they at the last GC to decide to have somebody in charge of Ellen White?
That's right. Yeah. Is there someone in charge of the gospel in each church? And Ted Wilson's talking about releasing 1 billion copies of Great Controversy. Like, you guys that are peddling this false hope, goodness me, it's not going to change. Sorry, Gillian.
That's all right.
What were you saying?
Who knows? I was just saying that Des knew Ellen White backwards. He had a photographic mind, and he spent 5 hours a day from childhood reading, and everything he studied, like I've shown you that page of Great Controversy where he's got everything circled and lines pointing in it. He highly respected her, always did. And he'd read all the critics as well. But she was not to take the place of scripture. And she said, we've got lots of things to unlearn. We've got lots of things to learn. And Des wanted to look into some of the things that she come up with, which the men, it wasn't their ideas. She put their ideas early in the book, the pioneers, but she had her own mind. Des found it fascinating.
Now, the next letter, is this the one that we spoke of that's to Parmenter from Des?
last week we'd finished by this time.
Well, I thought we'd just go a little bit longer today.
Now, I don't have that letter. It must be later in my... I'm now at... this is the letter from concerned pastors and scholars at Andrews University, but it is a great letter.
What's the date on it?
September the 10th, 1980.
Yeah, so I've got that one, but I've got this little one snuck in here. It's a short one. General Conference, September 1, 1980. And it's Dear Brother Parmenter from Desmond Ford.
I should have that. It's probably on one of the back pages.
It's got Dean Jennings writing something there.
That's right, original. Well, for some reason...
original, right.
And I've noted that he was the person who wrote on it because he's had his own collection.
Okay.
Which he's given to GC Archives.
Will I quickly read that one just in case it gets lost? Because it's nestled in there.
The reason this letter's important is, the next day Prexad are going to meet and they're going to decide to defrock Des. And Des is answering two things that he didn't answer in his previous question. So this is 2 weeks and a bit after Glacier View.
Right.
And he's just answering a couple of things. And in one of them, he says, my wife and I haven't had any contact with, enemies. Anyway, it didn't do any good, put it that way.
Okay.
It was flying in the air while Des's fate was already decided on the 2nd of September.
Right. I'll bring that up and give it a quick read. We've also had Chris Lucas just say, I'd love to maybe have you on the show. Well, you'll have to PM me, Chris, and tell me what the show's all about. And Chris has also said that even if I can't come on, he'll still promote this show. Thank you for doing that. Appreciate it. I'm glad you're enjoying the conversation we're having today. My very special guest is Gillian Ford. Her recent release is available on Amazon, and I'll pull that up on the screen after I've read this letter. Okay, so this is to Keith Parmenter, president of the division here in Australia at the time, September 1, 1980. Dear Brother Parmenter. So this is, of course, now about a month and a half after, or a month.
No, it's only 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Of course, September 1, yeah. Dear Brother Parmenter.
We're still in Washington.
There were two items to which I should have made reference in last week's letter. One, my relationship to the spirit of prophecy, and the other, proposed collusion with those critical of the church. I believe that Ellen G. White was entrusted with the gift of prophecy, a special messenger to this people. My Sanctuary manuscript, page 602 to 641, summarizes this conviction. See particularly from page 63 onwards, which is a polemic against those who wish to reject Ellen G. White. However, from 1887 to the present, our official statements regarding the nature of her inspiration deny inerrancy, and I fully agree with my brethren on that matter. As an inspired leader, she has and does teach the flock, but never are her writings to be made the whole basis of doctrine. Thus she affirmed repeatedly, and I gladly concur. On the other matter, neither I nor my wife have any relationship with critics of this church, which would be disloyalty to the which would bring disloyalty to the body of Christ. Despite accusations, we have never been a channel of in-house matters to such. We are well aware that much GC committee material is leaked to the outside, but it has not been through us. The limit of my sharing of information with any outside has been the statement that the task on which I was working was not a novel one, but one engaged upon by other men well known as, such as W. Prescott and L.E. Froome. In view of the materials circulated by Walter Ray on Prescott and certain non-traditional presentations to be found in Froome, such information was hardly top secret. With the warmest of regards, sincerely, your brother, Des Ford.
So that's one that I missed out in volume 2. So I'm glad I'm doing volume 3. Because that's an important letter. But of course, it made no difference to the outcome.
Yeah.
And by the time we've got 50, there was 52 pages. We're now on page 15. So we've got a couple to go yet. But when we get to 1983, you'll see how the planning behind it. The outcome is known a long time before the event happens.
Now, this is the September 10, 1980, an open letter to President Wilson, Neil Wilson, from concerned pastors and scholars at Andrews University Seminary and Graduate School. And we'll get you to read this one.
Okay. Now, as a background to this letter, this was written by pastors and actually PhD students. I shouldn't put scholars, because the scholars helped them to write it, but the only one who would sign it was Smuts van Rooyen. Remember, Smuts he ended up going to Good News for a while, and then eventually went back into the church, where he's been a great blessing. But this is one of the letters sent to Wilson, and I think somewhere I've read there were 55, but I think Ray Cottrell said there were about 200, objecting to what happened to Des. But this one's one of the best. This letter was forwarded to Elder Wilson with 39 signatures. It was formulated during the summer break at Andrews, when the greater part of the student body was on vacation. It therefore represents only a portion of the interested parties. The letter was prepared in consultation with seminary faculty, added note, signed by a list of PhD students, pastors, and Smuts van Rooyen. Other scholars at Andrews helped write the letter but did not sign their names. Dear Elder Wilson, we are pastors and scholars at Andrews Theological Seminary who are deeply concerned for the unity of the church. As Seventh-day Adventists committed to the church and its pursuit of truth, we wish to express our appreciation to you for convening the Glacier View Conference. We have not envied you your difficult task. Nevertheless, because of our love for this church, we deplore the rending asunder of Christ's body by what we consider to be the unjust recommendation that Dr. Desmond Ford not be employed in denominational service. This was improper for these reasons. 1. The 2 consensus statements unanimously voted at Glacier View by his peers were accepted by Dr. Ford. He was therefore in harmony with his brethren. 2. These consensus documents actually affirm Dr. Ford's major biblical concerns. For instance, they concede, A, the book of Hebrews pictures Christ going within the veil, i.e. into the most holy place, not the holy place, at his ascension to be our intercessor. The book of Hebrews does not teach a 2-apartment or 2-face ministry. Now, this was the first time the church had ever published this, because before that they taught the two-apartment ministry. So that was a big change. B, the defilement of the sanctuary in Daniel 8 is not caused by our sins, but by the desecrating work of the little horn. In other words, the term cleansing the sanctuary in Daniel 8 does not refer to an investigation of our sins, but to God's victory over Antichrist on our behalf. Another big change. Some of these things had never been published by the church before. C, the year-day principle is not explicitly identified as a scriptural rule for interpreting time prophecies. That's a really big one. Des had published in the ministry the best papers on the year-day principle in the church's history, and now they use those same things he wrote against him. Now, remember, this is from the consensus statement, which was written by the small groups at Glacier View. They had small groups. They were asked questions every day. And then Bill Johnson, who became the editor of the review, and Fritz Guy, was largely those two, wrote the consensus statements, which were read out on Friday and voted on. The 10-point statement, by contrast, was written by 6 people, and then the something committee sort of went over them. And I've mentioned somewhere recently again who were those 6 people, but that was ex cathedra. It was outside the conference. Most scholars didn't know it had been written. And when Bill Johnson was interviewed, he shakes his head about the 10-point statement. It sort of was devised by Neil Wilson as a way to get rid of Des. And what the 10-point statement was showed where Des differed in 10 points from the statement voted at Dallas, statement of faith, which was actually a reflection of traditional Adventism. So instead of looking at his manuscript, instead of using the consensus statement, these were set aside, and they used the statement showing where Des differed with the traditional view, which was not just at all. So, okay, we go back
But
to
what's interesting with these points that you're reading here is the church has never been able to defend their traditional beliefs. For example, the Hebrews, the 2-apartment and the 2-phase by Bible use alone. They have not been able to do it ever. Sorry, we're up to C.
So this is, Elaine explained in her interview, just to go over it, because, you know, you've got to know a fair bit to understand what these statements are. So they're writing down the points where they agreed with Des.
That's
now, this
right.
is the group at Glacier View who've written up this statement, and these are the points that agree with Des. Now, the whole idea of the census, which Elaine pointed out and I didn't know, in a court of law, is it shows where the 2 parties find agreement. So this is what we've got here. D, under inspiration, the New Testament writers look for the second coming of Christ in their day. They did not expect to wait 1900 years. Now, that's a direct blow to 1844, isn't it? E, our acquittal in the judgment is based solely on the continued decision we make with respect to Jesus. To have accepted his death on our behalf is to have passed already from condemnation to salvation. 3, church administration has apparently rejected Dr. Ford's willingness to cooperate in restoring church unity. We understand you would not accept his assurance to teach only that which was approved at Glacier View. Instead, the impossible demand has been laid on him to repudiate his conscientious convictions. We find this particularly difficult to accept in view of the fact that no explicit scriptural proof has been offered to negate his views.
Which is just what I was saying.
4,
Can I just interrupt? Who you said only Smuts Van Rooyen signed it.
so the scholars helped them write it.
Yeah, but who signed it?
Well, PhD students and pastors.
No, I didn't mean who collated it. Who signed it? How many people actually signed?
That's who. Well, on the original copy there was a list of signatures, but I don't have that. I only have a copy without signatures. So you'd have to go and find it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you could track that down to see who were brave enough to sign it.
So it's PH students, pastors at Andrews, and Smuts that signed it. He's the only one that signs it because the scholars are frightened they'll lose their job.
That's what I'm saying. So only Smuts put his name to it. The others helped write it, but none were brave enough to put their name to it.
That's what I've been told. And Smuts told me, so he'd know.
Yeah, exactly. Keep working on him to do an interview with me one day.
4, a 10-point statement has been used in condemning Dr. Ford's ministry, both in the review and in recent administrative actions. Here we question its legitimacy for this purpose. And I've just told you about the 10-point statement, showing where Des's manuscript differed from the Dallas Fundamental Statement of Faith, number 23, about the sanctuary. A, it does not represent the consensus of Dr. Ford's brethren in that it was neither discussed nor voted by the full group at Glacier View. B, it is in fact It, in fact, contradicts the spirit and letter of the consensus statement at certain key points. C. The authors of the document intended it to clarify communication at the conference, did not know it would be used to jeopardize Dr. Ford's ministry.
Yes.
5. You assured the church in writing, review July 9, that the Glacier View Conference would not be a trial of Des Ford. Evidence indicates, however, that it was primarily a trial, and administrative action was begun there that will apparently deprive him of his credentials. It hadn't happened yet. This is September the 10th. But you see, they know. In view of the foregoing facts, we must ask, is it right to allow a minister to be defrocked who is in basic harmony with the theological consensus of his church? Is it right to condemn a man's theology by using a document, the 10-point statement, that was not even discussed, let alone approved by the body of delegates appointed to judge his arguments? Is it right to ostracize a worker whose major biblical views, while criticized by some, have nevertheless been largely accepted by the body established to evaluate their merit? Is it right to ask anybody to give up his honest convictions, especially when he offers to table them while study continues and when no scriptural proof has shown them to be wrong? Because of our desire that justice be done and that reconciliation occur, we earnestly request that the following actions be taken. 1. The review should frankly acknowledge and explain Dr. Ford's contributions to Adventist sanctuary theology as accepted at Glacier View in the consensus statement, and rectify its prejudicial reporting of denominational issues. 2. A committee should be formed that include a wide representation of Dr. Ford's fellow pastors and scholars to review administrative actions regarding his employment as pastor in the denomination. 3. The General Conference should encourage church administrators to not regard with suspicion the workers and laypersons who share scriptural concerns in common with Dr. Ford. 4. The administration should seek to be reconciled with those Adventists who feel that excessive concern for denominational tradition is eclipsing the rightful place of Christ and the Bible. As you know, some congregations have already withdrawn from conference affiliation, others are splitting internally, and large numbers of denominational workers are fearful that their present connection with the organisation is in jeopardy. We believe that decisive action on your part to redress what seems to be injustice can still avert a major fragmentation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The fruit of righteousness will be peace. The effect of righteousness will be quietness and confidence forever. Isaiah 32:17. Yours for both unity and truth. And then there's a list of names.
That's what I'm confused about. Is there a list of names? I thought only Smuts put his name to it.
No, only among the scholars. But PhD students and pastors signed it. The other scholars didn't sign it.
Right.
There was a list of signatures, but not the scholars.
Right. I'd love if you didn't mind, if you could dig a tiny bit and see if you can find the actual names of those that did put their name to it.
I would have put it in if I had it, because I put it on another one. It's not on my copy.
Maybe just check if Smuts has got a copy, because I think those people that did put their name to it should get a commendation.
Well, it's an excellent letter. It's absolutely
it is amazing.
accurate.
Yeah. I remember we read it.
There were other letters, but this is the best one.
It's so good. It just nails the whole thing. I remember we read it, I think, once Inside Scoop.
The fact that the scholars did not sign it, except for Smuts, who was summarily put out as well.
Yeah, I know.
Within a short time. Lessens its clout.
Yeah.
Of course.
I remember listening to lots of Smuts recordings back in the day. I'd come across them in the early 90s. And he was a very gifted speaker. This is a good point too. How they treated Ford makes the world look at Seventh-day Adventists terribly. I think that's very true and evident. Okay, let's
There's a big difference of opinion. I don't know whether you can hear my water tank going on and off in the background.
No.
Oh, okay. That's because the air conditioning man's been here
Okay.
washing all the filters out, and he hasn't switched the outside hoses off properly.
Let's finish today with the Geraghty to Kenneth Wood letter.
You can read that.
And like you said, Gillian, that last letter is gold. I think we read it in Inside Scoop once, and I remember being blown away, but I don't think we've ever had it presented in the main group before. And that response is so concise and erudite and skillfully put together. It's one that I think everyone should read. Okay, well, I will bring up the letter and I really enjoyed my interview with Geraghty and Fritz Guy in season 2.
They didn't, because Fritz is over 90. He was very positive about Des. And in the end, they gave in because I kept talking to Jonathan Butler, and he taught them into doing that interview. And they said, that poor woman, she's been through so much. That's why they did it.
I did it.
Fritz is over 90, and they didn't really seem to be aware of how the 10-point doc statement was used. And I think that's, even though he's older and he might have forgotten, Bill Johnson didn't either. This was, it was sleight of hand. I've used that elsewhere.
Yeah.
On the part of
so you think that maybe even Fritz Guy and Johnson didn't even really know about that because they weren't present the next day, were they?
Well, Bill Johnson, and I can't remember, I think he talked to Len and she told him about it. But my understanding is he didn't know about it until he talked to Norm Young. Now, because this is secondhand sources, I'm not sure. And he thought that Des in the meeting had refused his consensus, and he'd spent many hours on it, but Des didn't. He was very enthusiastic about it. It's still acknowledged 1844, but Des said to them on the Friday afternoon meeting, he said, you've come so far in the consensus statement, in a couple of years you'll come all the way. And of course they didn't like that at all. And the men who were talking to us, I mean, these weren't dumbbells, but they weren't scholars by and large. No. They didn't get that the consensus statement and the 10-point statement were quite different.
Yeah.
They thought they were the same. So I told you about Francis Wernick, who was a vice president. When Des said that, he sort of said, do you mean to say that they're not the same? He said, if I'd known that, I wouldn't have voted for the consensus, which I thought was the funniest line of the meeting, because he obviously didn't know what it said. But a lot of times when you've got something like that, people read it according to their own.
Well, Geraghty Larry Geraghty and Fritz Guy weren't there on the Friday, though, were they? On that Friday meeting. I think that's when that 10-point was produced, isn't it?
I think what I should have done was to leave and gone and got some of the scholars and brought them into the meeting.
Yeah. But that is when the 10-point was brought in, isn't it? The Friday. And a lot of people left the Thursday night. So it was a bit of an ambush.
It was an ambush.
And poor Norm Young was thrown under the bus with it. I think he knew he was being hard on Des, but he honestly thought it was just for he said to me in the interview that it was more like they wanted to just have a bit of information for the scholars that where does Des deeply disagree with us. He didn't think they were going to be kind of using it as a part of the
what Neil Wilson
ambush.
said was that a lot of the administrators couldn't follow the issues and they wanted to know, bottom line, where are the differences? Yes. That's how it was presented. And Des asked, Norm asked Des. I mean, we never objected to the fact that Des said better you, Norman, than anybody else, because Norman was one of the brightest there. So that never ever bothered us.
Yeah. Moto Sapien, who I think is a fan of Dr. Maxwell's. Last week's video, I posted a link to Dr. Maxwell's series on Glacier View from 1983. He was the head of the theology department. So it's interesting to hear him say he wasn't happy with the way that was the leadership handled the issue. So Moto Sapien,
Well,
if you
I've never seen that. I've never seen those.
No, and Moto Sapien, if you posted that, let us know if you posted it in Facebook or on YouTube, because YouTube doesn't keep the comments that are posted in the live stream, only comments that are posted after. So please post that again, preferably in the Facebook group, because it's much easier to track down. Okay, we'll finish with this reading of. I'm looking forward to this one. This is from to Elder Wood, Kenneth Wood, and from Barry Garrity. Tell us a little bit about Kenneth Wood before I start reading it.
Well, Kenneth Wood was the editor of the review, and actually he was at Emmanuel College, which is the name for the tertiary Adventist college before the campus moved to Andrews, to Michigan, from Washington, D.C. So Des knew him there, and he was very much of the theology of the Standish Brothers with Herb Douglas, sinful nature of Christ and Jesus the model man, and Jesus is our example rather than being a substitute.
If he can do it, we can do it.
That's right.
And if he can do it, we can do it, and we have to do it to get salvation.
Now,
okay,
I've just put, there's a little thing on the back of the review, and I think it was August 27. I've just put it in volume 3, where Kenneth Wood writes, variant views rejected. So this is August 27. This is less than 2 weeks after Glacier View. Now, remember that when we came out of the meeting at Prexad, I was asked by Fred Belton what happened. I said, well, they fired him. Well, that's what I thought I said. It's a long time ago. And, of course, that went around like a tsunami. And then I got called aside by Parmenter, probably on the Sabbath, and told that I misrepresented them. And that's what they told the scholars, that I was emotional and I'd misrepresented what happened. And in his mind, they couldn't actually fire Des because it had to go through 2 or 3 committees and then go through the Australian executive. But the terms were set. It was, and I talked to Des just before he died, and he said it was the end on the Friday afternoon. He said, you weren't wrong. But of course, it was very embarrassing to them to get faced with this hostility from the scholars who were still there. So the fact that Kenneth Wood on the 27th of August said variant views rejected, talking about Glacier View and Des.
Yes.
At Glacier View on the Friday afternoon shows that I was right.
Yeah, that's important.
That's what he was told. He was told it's all over.
Yeah. And it
this
was all over. You'd assessed it correctly, but the process just hadn't been completed.
So this is why you've got to go over and over and over these documents, because you find evidence for something in another document, and it's wonderful. You piece it together like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
Now, Larry Garrity is, in this letter, is objecting to that statement. So that gives you that background for that.
And Moto Sapien has written that he did post it on YouTube after, so it will be there. But if possible, if you are in the Facebook group, it'd be great if you could post it there, or send it to me privately if you don't want your name revealed. Okay, dear Elder Wood, as a participant in the sanctuary. Oh, so was Kenneth Wood there at Glacier View?
Do you know? I don't know, but it will be on in the ministry.
Yeah,
I suspect he would. Well, Herb Douglas was there.
yeah.
I would think. I'm pretty sure.
But he is saying that.
I don't think he would have missed it because he wrote before Glacier View to somebody. We didn't bring Des to Washington, you know, to teach us anything. He came to Washington to change his mind, and that's pretty much what was said on. You've got to change your mind and teach traditional Adventism, or you're out. That was. That's what Parmenter said on the Thursday afternoon with the whole group witnessing it. And he said it on the Friday as well.
And just another quick aside, Motor Sapien has said he doesn't do book face. So it's I'll try and find it, the link that shares Dr. Maxwell's series on Glacier View from 1983. That would be a valuable thing to read. So it's a video. I'll very much look forward to that, whether it's read or video, and I will put it in the comments on the Facebook.
He wants your email, Peter.
Oh, my email, that would be great. I'll put that in the comments later. As a participant in the Sanctuary Review Committee at Glacier View Ranch, I'm surprised and disappointed at the apparently biased way the results have been handled in the Adventist Review. First of all, to announce on the back page, August 28, variant views rejected, was at best a half-truth. The other half is that many of the views advocated by Des Ford were accepted by the consensus statements. Why was that not brought out? Are we afraid to publicly admit the progress we made in Colorado at arriving at a clearer, more biblically based doctrine of the sanctuary? Second, in your fuller report of the Sanctuary Review Committee, September 4, I wish the documents generated by the committee had been published in a different order and that one of them had been more adequately introduced. Bill Johnson provided a very fair and helpful overview of the meeting, though the heading, the Sanctuary Review Committee, finds strong support for the Church's historic position. It's classic Bill, does not accurately reflect the full story. In retrospect, it may have been wise for Bill to clarify what he meant by the consensus statements, reaffirm the historic interpretation of the Church. When those of us who were there know that certain previous historic interpretations of the Church were also not confirmed, in any case, it seems we're not confirmed. In any case, it seems to me that Bill's article should have been followed by the two consensus statements, which were the real achievement of all the delegates. To give prominence to the 10-point statement suggests the committee was a trial of Dr. Ford, rather than an attempt to deal dispassionately with the issues he raised. Furthermore, in the editorial introduction to the 10-point statement, I think it should have been made clear that the assignment given to the committee of 6 was to succinctly point out the differences between Dr. Ford's position and those traditionally taught by the Church. Unless I'm misinformed, their task was not to attempt an overall evaluation of his document. While the information in your editorial introduction is accurate, the total impression, there's a line missing, but I'd say the total impression concluded something there. Know that in at least 7 of the 10 points, the consensus statements move significantly in Dr. Ford's direction. This is nowhere explicitly shared with your readers. While I feel strongly about the criticisms I've made because I'm so anxious to maintain unity in the Church by attempting to tell the whole truth about what I feel was a very open and fair committee, I also want to commend you for publishing so promptly the documents generated by the committee. In doing so, you have put the whole Church in your debt, i.e. we haven't had to wait for Spectrum verdict publications or some other extra-denominational source. Cordially, Lawrence T. Garrity.
So that sort of helps in a couple of ways. One, I've just explained to you about the variant views. That validates what I said when I walked out of the room. And of course, they hadn't said to me, You're not to speak of anything when you go out there. And Fred was a good friend. He was Des's boss. He asked me, so, you know, I answered him. And I never was mean about it. I never, you can tell by the way I wrote about poor old Pastor Parmenter. I look back and I'm amazed at myself. But the other thing that's here is the statement, which Des has said, it's not quite the same. With regard to the 10-point document, in at least 7 of the 10 points, the consensus statements move significantly in Dr. Ford's direction. Now, that's what you like to see. He's saying, we said in 7 of the 12 points, and I've given you a list somewhere else. I think it's in volume 1 or 2 of those 12 points. 7 of them were key, major points, and we've just read some of them, and they were things the church had never said before. So that's why you like correspondence. You know, a lot of it is I've got stuff that we say. I've said to you, I can say to you that Dr. Larendell came in so enthusiastic. He loved Des. He was a hero. He loved his book, Daniel, and so on. He came in and he said, you know, I hadn't heard about Antiochus Epiphanes. I'm annoyed that I haven't been told. I'll go back and study it. Now, I can tell you that happened. I stood beside Des. It happened. However, last week, I think it was last week, we read that letter from Hans written in March. How can I help you? And I think you're on the right track. And so if you've got other people's comments to substantiate it, it's wonderful. This is why my books, they can't answer. They cannot answer.
I know. I love it. It's black and white.
A lot of it's from what they said.
From the horses' mouths. Now, Phil Curry, good friend of mine, has just written, whenever we get a compliment, I like to post those because I get a truckload of negative stuff. Great listening, particularly to a history which we lived through. Thanks for your commitment to exploring truths around this era in church history and the Fords. Thank you, Phil. Coming from you, that means a lot. Appreciate it. Now, I think we will wrap it up for today. Thanks, everyone, for watching. This doesn't conclude, even though in the writing it says 3 of 3. I will be changing that later. We are going to continue this. We've got a bunch of letters we're going to get through because it is such an important part of Adventist history. And I'm a former Adventist looking in from the outside at this incredible, very interesting denomination. So we'll probably get up to about 6, I'd say. I liked in one of your comments, you said, I like your number counting or good luck with your maths or something. My date setting. Now, we may not be able to...
I'm a universal Adventist, meaning my name is up in the books of heaven, even though it's not on the books down here.
Now,
you've heard of the Universal Church.
Oh, yes, oh, definitely. Now, we may not be able to have the interview next week because I thought that we would have finished in the 3. I'm so glad we haven't because I'm loving these letters. But I think I've got someone else booked in for next week. But I will chat to you, Gillian, off air about that. And I'll let everyone else know what's going on. Your homework also is to get Bob to do another interview with me very soon. It's actually Bob Brinsmead. It's inspiring me to...
you better do it soon because he's off to the Philippines.
Is he? Okay. Well, you've got to ask on my behalf.
I've got to do a rapid proofread to correct all those errors before I give him the PDF.
So tell him to... I'd love to do one anytime in the next week even would be brilliant. It's just,
I mean, if anybody got hate mail, it was Bob Brinsmead.
Oh, yeah.
The way the church treated him was terrible.
Yeah. He's got
and
a great...
So he's grateful. He said, he wrote to me after reading the stuff and he said, Des was so kind to me.
Now,
but
my guest
today... the way Bob behaved, as I look back, was a lot more ethical in the way some of the church leaders.
Yeah.
And as Dad said, he didn't want to go. It got to the point where he wouldn't go back in. He said because a lot of the church leaders, when they're on their own, they're fine, but when they get together, then.
Yeah, that's true. Well, if you get a chance to say, I'd love to interview him. Motor Sapien has just written, catch you next week if you can. I try and have an interview every Thursday, 11:30 our time, which Pacific time's around 6:30 the Wednesday. I think that's right, just to give people a rough idea of the context between here and America, the US of A. So
when is John Rosier coming back?
So I'm hoping to have John this Monday night. I've just got to double check because I've had a couple of other things I've had to do of late. So I will sort all that out. But yes, he and I are finishing off a several-parter interview, which has been going fantastically as well. So thanks everyone for your support. My guest today has been Gillian Ford, author of On the Way to Glacier View, Volume 1 and 2, which is available on Amazon right now. Go and buy it. It is incredible. And I love that.
It's not what you call a bestseller. I think I've sold 24 now. I sold 4
2 dozen's great. That's good.
I sold 4 sets this week.
Yeah, well, volume 3 is coming.
You know, I only need 24 out there. As long as it's out there, that's all I care about.
Now, well, I'm just going to bring up one last comment that Phil Curry has just made, because if I don't, it won't be shown on here. So I'll just quickly bring that up. And the joys of going live. You have highlighted that change is such a difficult issue at the best of times. Throw in the political issues which church administration have with any theological change. Ably makes it more difficult. Maintaining a stable church theologically may be, it goes off the page there, so I have to just read here, may be in conflict with discovering greater truths. Yeah, that's true. Interesting thought. Very true. Okay, well, thank you very much, Gillian. Those watching, please, it takes like half a second. Lean forward, click the like button, click subscribe button. You have got no idea how much it helps the algorithms. Also, your support via PayPal, Peter Dixon Music, please, that helps me particularly with getting season 2 up onto the podcast platform and YouTube. Needs to be out there into the public realm. It had such a huge positive response, but only in the Facebook group, because it's a private group. So I'm very keen, but I do need some help. So please, if you've got even $4 or whatever the price of a coffee is now, that would just be so helpful.
Peter, you asked me to hang on the grey screen. I'm just letting you know that I will.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, everyone else. Until next time, see you later.